Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I am not Matt Manocherian. This is Alex Vigderman taking Matt's spot for the week. Matt is across the world. He's in India. So we're going to have the rest of the R&D group, the cats away so the mice will play. And we're going to have a potluck this afternoon. And that basically means that each of us brought our own stats that relate to luck and what it means to have things going well for you or going poorly for you. Before we get started on any of that, Bryce Rossler and James Weaver are here, and I will ask each of you, if you were at a potluck, what is your go-to dish to bring? Bryce, you can go first.
And cranberry sauce.
Canned cranberry sauce. This is not, I mean, it's certainly seasonal, but you would bring that even in like mid-June?
No, mid-June, I would probably bring some dessert, like brownies. Of course, they would be store-bought because I'm no baker, but I'd have to splurge to get something that could pass as homemade.
I will say that my answer might be similar. I frequently bring chocolate chip cookies to things like this. James, do you have a better culinary option?
So I'm going to say what I would bring, but I probably wouldn't make it. But it is these cheesy potatoes that my mom makes all the time with frosted flakes crunched on top of them that are always really, really good to have as a good like brunch item. So like they can easily eat for breakfast and or dinner.
And this is frosted. This is frosted flakes, not just cornflakes.
Oh, my bad. Cornflakes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. My bad.
I was going to say that's real interesting. Speaking of sweet and cheesy, I had chocolate covered Cheetos a couple of weeks ago. It was an interesting experience. Anyway, so we're having a potluck. And first, I think this idea sort of popped into my head last week, and sort of incidentally, there was a tweet from Tom Bliss, data scientist for the NFL, who does this sort of weekly where he looks at win probability added by different sort of luck-based things. So a lot of this will sort of overlap conceptually with that, but make sure to take a look at some of his tweets over the weeks to see this kind of stuff in the context of win probability. But James, how do we sort of think about the different categories of luck in this case?
Yeah, so for the purpose of what we're going to talk about today, I think we all kind of came to the conclusion of categorizing luck, or variance in this case, into two buckets. The first one being the metrics that aren't stable from year to year, and the second one being kind of a misfortune metric. So in terms of the metrics that are not stable, we're going to be looking at certain stats, metrics of teams, players, of stats that typically aren't sticky from year to year. So in one year, a team might have for an extreme example, 100% completion percentage, and then the next year it could be 0. That's not exactly one that we're going to be talking about, which isn't one, but something along that case. For these types, we think of like a scatter plot with like a graph that shows no correlation between two stats on the X and Y axes. So just a scattered plot of points around the graph. And then in terms of the misfortune, these are items that affect your success that you have little or no control over. So players you play with, who are your opponents, and in certain cases, the other team's field goal kicker. So we'll get into a little bit more about those items, but those are kind of the two buckets that we'll be clarifying those today.
Cool. So let's start with, I guess we'll start with these sort of random variance, or sort of analogous to random variance category. So what do you got going on first?
Yeah, so the first one we want to talk about today is fumble luck. And so this is one where teams that fumble a lot, or teams that do recover a lot of fumbles that are put on the ground, or don't recover a lot of fumbles that are put on the ground. So in this case, we broke this out into two separate categories: offensive fumble loss percentage and defensive fumble recovery percentage. So in terms of the offense, we have teams that have high fumble loss percentages. So the Bucs in first have lost 80% of their fumbles, which is extremely high. Then in second, we have the Eagles that come in at 77%. We then have a kind of a mosh pit with the Lions, Seahawks, Browns, and Rams that come in at 75%, and the 49ers and Saints that come in at 72.7%. So these are all teams that have lost fumbles at a high rate. On the flip side, we have the teams that have lost the lowest amount of fumbles that they have put on the ground, starting off with the Panthers with the lowest at 20%. Raiders and Cardinals tied for second lowest at 25, Bears, Texans at 30, and then the Packers and the Steelers at 33.
So we're seeing, to sort of sum up here, we're seing the Bucks as an example of a team that has lost a lot more fumbles than you'd expect. So they've been kind of unlucky in this case, and the Panthers on the flip side of that being very lucky, at least from this perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you might be arguing too, with the Bucks running it as much as they do, that number could be higher than it is anyway. But yeah, that is the case.
All right. So on the defensive side, how do things look?
Yeah. So on the defensive side, these are percentages of teams of fumbles that they have recovered on the defensive side of the ball. So in first, we actually have the Falcons at 100%. So every time that they have forced a fumble, they have recovered it. Now, granted, there are only 5 of those cases, so it's not a high number, but still certainly a high percentage. In second, we have the Chiefs at 71%. Then the Chiefs and the Vikings are both at 71%. And then the Jaguars and Cowboys are both at 67%. And on the low end of the spectrum, meaning that the teams that have not recovered as many fumbles would be the Broncos at 30%, the Jets at 20%, and then the Texans at 17%.
That Broncos number seems kind of crazy. In the Broncos being at 30% recovery of their forced fumbles, but having 13 of them is, it's especially considering how important turnovers are. It's a pretty big deal. And I guess the Jets similarly, like forcing 10 fumbles and only recovering 2 of them and the Jets, have had both of these teams have had very good defenses, and this is sort of absolutely part of it. But imagine what those defenses would be like if they were recovering as many of the fumbles as they could be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost as if that they might have better quarterback play in that case too if they recovered more fumbles.
I don't know if they'd have better quarterback play, but they would give their questionable quarterbacks more opportunities to play quarterback.
Yes.
Yeah, the Jets are second in EPA per play, and then the Broncos are ninth.
Yeah. So and that's the EPA being captured there is not, a forced fumble, if it just gets recovered by the offense, is just like a tackle, right? There's no change in the EPA. So to have as many possible fumbles where those are huge EPA swings, like the Jets could very easily be like the best defense in the NFL from an EPA perspective if they had an average amount of fumble recoveries off of their forced fumbles.
I made an oopsie. Denver's actually 4th.
How dare you?
Coding a little too fast over here. I don't have my stat check.
All right, so we'll jump around to other stuff. So arguably, I guess we could have started with this one, but because it's a little bit more sort of holistic. But one of the sort of primary ways that we can think about luck when it comes to the team level is teams who are outperforming or underperforming their sort of underlying metrics. So the more popular or common one might be Pythagorean record. That's taking your points scored and points allowed and basically getting an estimated win-loss record. So by that metric, the teams that have been the luckiest, to some extent, these are just the teams who have the most wins. So like the Vikings are 3 wins ahead of their skis, so to speak. Eagles 2 wins ahead, Dolphins 2 wins ahead, Giants 2 wins ahead. And the teams that have been unlucky from the perspective of winning fewer games than their points scored and points allowed would suggest, the Jaguars are down by 2 wins, the Bears like 1.5 wins, and the Raiders a little bit over 1 win. So interesting that there are more teams that are more lucky than there are teams that are unlucky, but the teams that are at the top end there are kind of the teams that you would expect. It's the Vikings and Giants have been viewed as these sort of mirage type of teams in terms of their record, and the Eagles and Dolphins are just, teams that have very good records are likely to be getting good skill and good performance.
And I think it's really fitting that the Vikings are first in that.
Yeah, and I think, the reason that we talk about these kinds of things during the season is that we expect things to sort of even out a bit as the season goes on. Mm-hmm. The fumble luck thing is not necessarily, the teams that we talked about in the previous section are not really showing up primarily here, but that is the sort of thing that you would expect to even out over time and cause teams to balance out their luck a bit. Another way of thinking about this in terms of the team quality is by using some kind of instead of using points for and points allowed, you can use sort of like an additional layer down, and you can basically say, I'm going to take all of the players' performances and add it up and say, how many how good should your team be based on the collection of players that you've put on the field and how well they've done, and then how does that compare? And so we can use wins above replacement for that. SIS has our own internal WAR metric that is based on the total points system. So this will feel very similar. The teams that are lucky in this respect are the Vikings, the Giants, the Chargers, and the Steelers. And the teams that have been unlucky are the Broncos, Jaguars, Bears, and Texans. So you can see that on the lucky side, we have the Vikings and Giants showing up multiple times. On the unlucky side, we have the Jaguars and Bears showing up multiple times. It is sort of interesting that you lose the Eagles as a team that's been particularly lucky because so while from a scoring perspective, they've scored less than you'd expect, just in terms of like adding up the contributions of the individual players, they have not actually been that lucky.
Alex, what is the interplay here for the Dolphins being lucky by Pythagorean wins versus WAR within the context of Tua's injury? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Context of Tua's injury, yeah,
because they missed some games from him. So and WAR is obviously measuring players rather than outcomes of scores. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that it's possible that there's something that happens there. Although, so in this case, we're saying that the Dolphins have better player performance than they have scoring. So you could argue, I suppose, that the skill of Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and the people who've sort of buoyed the Dolphins with Tua out allows you to have better like WAR performance than you might have scoring performance, because one of the things that our WAR tries to do is sort of disentangle the contributions of players. So it should be able to handle the notion of this player is out, but the other players are still good, right? But it's more likely to be capturing stuff like, and actually our WAR, for example, when a fumble happens, we count each fumble as basically a coin flip. Like we don't care in terms of evaluating the players. We don't actually use the result of the fumble in terms of measuring what happens to the person who fumbled the ball. So we are kind of balancing some of that out already. And so typically I would think that I would trust the WAR-based version more than the scoring-based version, because points are somewhat fickle themselves, right? Getting turnovers returned for touchdowns and that sort of thing have these big swings in scoring that aren't necessarily reflective of skill.
But they still, I don't know how many games Teddy Bridgewater started, but I think Bridgewater played a couple games they lost. So you're still weighing it down a bit.
Yeah, that's definitely, I would think that unless, I guess I would say that I don't think that the quarterback thing would cause a difference between how WAR would see it and how scoring would see it, unless you had a scenario in which a team was performing well and not getting it done in the red zone, that sort of thing. And speaking of situational stuff, James, a couple of things on sort of what we might call sequencing luck. So the idea of being successful in some situations and not successful in other situations, where the result is very important in some situations and not others, but like the way that you play shouldn't be the same. So one might be to think about it with early downs versus late downs, right? Like if you perform well on first and second down, you should theoretically perform well on third and fourth down, but that's not true of all teams.
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of keep on that train, when it comes to third downs, it's almost like you're forced your hand on some of the play calls that you have. You have to pick up the first down, so you're kind of forced into a game script of what you have to do to get the X amount of yards to get the first down. Meanwhile, as on first and second down, you're trying to pick up yards and do what you can to either A, get the first down, or get close within third and manageable. So it's kind of been proven with some studies that first and second down is stickier in terms of your performance from year to year, and shows a higher output of success when you're doing better on first and second down. So far this year, first we'll start on offense. This is in terms of EPA per play on early downs. The top 5 teams that we have are the Chiefs, Bills, Ravens, Packers, and Raiders. So it's kind of interesting to see the Packers on there. And then in the bottom 5, we have the Rams, Steelers, Texans, Broncos, and Bears, which all seem to be correctly placed down there.
The Packers inclusion there is interesting. It is a little bit of like that team has had more of a running identity this year than they have in past years, and they have a pretty good stable of running backs, and they've had a little bit more. They were pretty unstable on the offensive line in the past, so it's not totally shocking to see that they would have like pretty good early down performance, but top 5 considering what we've seen from them this year, I am pretty surprised by.
Yeah, and then as we get into the late down stuff here, I'll hop back on your point in a second. So in terms of late down EPA per play, the top 5, we have the Chiefs, Eagles, Bills, Dolphins, and Bengals. So all teams that you would think that are certainly in viable playoff and or conference contention for sure. And then in the bottom 5, we have the Colts, Texans, Packers, Panthers, and Broncos. So that you can see that's for the Packers' offensive performance is stalled out. So granted, with I don't know what's going on with the Rodgers injury and any motivation, I guess at this point with most likely being eliminated from the playoffs, but they would certainly be a potential candidate for positive offensive regression.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because it's if all else remained equal, you would view it that way. But it's hard to judge how that team's going to react in the tail end of the season.
The Eagles being here interests me in the middle of Hurts MVP candidacy because I get a little bit of deja vu from the Carson Wentz year where he had late game heroics and late down heroics, and sure enough, it ended up not being stable. So I think Hurts is a little better than Wentz, but I can't help but think about that season when I see the Eagles here.
Yeah, I think I had the same thought, and I think that I don't feel like there's been as many like outlandish, crazy. Like I remember a couple of ridiculous Carson Wentz plays on like 3rd and long type things where he's up against the sideline and he just chucks it downfield and gets somebody who's like tiptoeing. I don't feel like Hurts has done as much of that. A lot of it has been this sort of like same scramble ability, tuck it and get first downs. But yeah, it's the evidence is definitely there that they're getting kind of a weird season. And, any team that's having a kind of offensive success that they've had this year without having a ton of experience doing that in the past, I would be suspect of. And this sort of leans into that. What do you got, James?
So the next thing I want to talk about was more of the positive pass percentage leaders on early down as well, as passing on first down has been another one of the keys to success for teams offensively. So at the top end of that spectrum, we have the Geno Smith-led Seattle Seahawks at 55.8% positive pass percentage, Cowboys in second with 53.4%, Dolphins in third with 52.8%, Chiefs in fourth at 52%, and the Bills in fifth at 52%. At the bottom end of that spectrum, we have the worst as the Bears at 37%, Broncos at 38%, Panthers at 39%, Texans at 40%, and the Jets at 41%.
We've all been sort of surprised by the Seahawks in terms of their offense, but to be like the number one team by this metric that we would think would be pretty like informative of your overall offense, that's pretty awesome for them.
Yeah, and especially coming in previously with a run first kind of an offense too. Be first in this category is certainly one that we wouldn't expect coming into the season.
Yeah, it's not a reflection of like a change. It's not like a tendency thing, right? This is just as a percentage of pass plays, but it is definitely indicative of like, hey, you can succeed doing this, and you don't need a Russell Wilson type player to justify it.
Right.
A former Russell Wilson type player. Russell Wilson type players are at the bottom of this list, incidentally.
Yes.
The Seahawks being there is really interesting just because within the greater scheme of this episode, we're talking about luck, and for them to have Geno Smith sort of fall into their lap. I know that they've had him for a while, but I don't think that Seahawks brass would tell you that they expected this. So that's kind of a lucky thing in and of itself.
Yeah, that one's really hard to pin down as like what kind of luck is it? How much maybe there's some development work that they did. I don't know. But yeah, that's some wild stuff.
And then to cap it off here, get into the defenses a little bit. So same thing, early down EPA per play leaders in the top 5. we have the 49ers, Bills, Jets, Patriots, and Bucks. And then in the bottom 5, we have the Falcons, Raiders, Packers, Giants, and Browns. So in terms of late down EPA per play, we have in the top 5, Broncos, Cowboys, Patriots, Eagles, Packers. And then in the bottom 5, we have the Lions, Bills, Bears, Texans, Raiders. So the Bills appearing in the top 5 in early down and the bottom 5 in late down.
Yeah, that's a way to, just in terms of, these are like the soft things, right? Like not getting off on third down has such a theoretical subjective impact on the way that your defense performs that's a tough combo to be one of the best defenses on early downs and then just getting beat on third and fourth down.
Yeah, I think too, the return of Trey White will certainly help that, lock down some receivers on the outside to minimize those third down conversions. And then getting back, hopefully, a healthy Greg Rousseau will also intensify the pass rush for the Bills.
Also notable that the Eagles, once again, late down performance. As a Philly person, I'm not particularly excited to see that, but I definitely would, at least in my perception, I would feel like late down EPA per play performance for defense is even less like stable than offensive. Like in terms of offensive third down, you might be scheming certain things, or you might have been put in certain positions by your first and second down performance, and you can rely on that more consistently than the situations you're finding yourself in late downs on defense.
James, I could be mistaken, but didn't you, in your defensive efficiencies article this week, note a recent trend with the Eagles defense, like the last 3 or 4 weeks, in terms of how they've performed?
Yeah, I think it was with their passing defense, right? I think their yards allowed per play were certainly higher than what they were in the weeks prior to that. I think it was by a margin of 3 too, which was extremely high.
Jordan Davis ruins the defense in all ways. You gotta get him back on the field or something like that. So before we get on to the next categories, we can talk about something that is admittedly not available yet, but it's coming, and it's actually coming with more features than we had originally planned on including in this initial release. So our relationship with the 33rd Team site has been expanding over the course of the year, and one of the things that we're adding as part of their Edge sort of fantasy and betting oriented product line is a trenches tool. So we're using our total points metric to evaluate the offensive and defensive fronts of each team and sort of pair them up to see where the best matchups are this week. So incidentally, from the trenches perspective, both the Titans and the Eagles playing each other are among the best matchups this week, and sort of like the overall offense and defense. In terms of better matchups, the Jaguars against the Lions defense, Bryce, a good matchup both in pass blocking and run blocking. And then also, other things that you can get through this tool, which we'll have available in the next week or so, I anticipate, is a whole bunch of stats that sort of like inform how you might evaluate a matchup. So you don't necessarily just want the overall rating. We can also say that, for example, when the Titans offense is facing the Eagles defense, the Titans are using, zone runs a lot more. So you have to watch out for that in terms of the Eagles performance. The Eagles are number 1 in terms of forcing blown blocks in the passing game. They also are number 1 in snap to pressure time, so that they get their pressures faster than anybody. So you definitely would need to get the ball out quickly, which might be a problem for, Titans team that relies a lot on play action passing. In the running game, the Eagles have gotten a lot of plays where they're hitting the running back at the line of scrimmage or behind it. So they're third in that percentage. So yeah, look for this tool to exist on the 33rd Team website in hopefully a week or so. And we'll be able to look into sort of your fantasy playoff matchups with a lot more information at your fingertips. All right, so let's move on to the next sort of category in this conversation. So we talked about random variance, things that sort of are more uncorrelated things that you would not expect to continue, year over year, let alone within a given season. This will be definitely something that is more of what we'll call fortune or misfortune. It's things that are situational factors, particularly with your team that, might exist year over year, but also are the sorts of things that maybe you get your teammate an extra good gift for the holidays because they've been treating you well this season. So the first we'll start off with is players who have had good or bad quarterback accuracy. So for this, you can think of quarterback accuracy in a few different ways. For this, we'll talk about catchable percentage, the percentage of throws that SIS has viewed as catchable. The lowest is probably not the most surprising in the world. Kyle Pitts, 61% of his targets have been deemed catchable, so 39 uncatchable. Cameron Brate is kind of interesting at 63%. Both of these guys, of course, have gotten hurt, which is its own version of bad luck, but kind of interesting, particularly with Brate, with Brady at quarterback, to have one of the lower rates of catchable passes coming your way. In terms of players who have had good luck, I guess you could argue, in terms of having more accurate passes than sort of average, you can think about this in kind of two ways, because players who have really short target depth, I've basically excluded running backs from this conversation. And of course, the players, once you exclude running backs, then the next list of players is all tight ends. So like Dallas Goedert, Noah Fant, Austin Hooper are all players who have had very high catchable percentages, but at least their average throw depth is in the 6 range. If you wanted to go to the next group of players who have more legitimate ADOTs, so to speak, Jalen Waddle, DeAndre Hopkins, and Devonta Smith get the sort of particularly honorable mention. And if anyone's curious, Waddle is 5 percentage points or so higher than Tyreek Hill, doing a lot of kind of similar things for the Dolphins.
So that the Alabama Tua to Jalen connection is real, huh?
Yeah, sure. I'm sure that he is. Well, yeah. I will say that this is catchable percentage, not on target percentage, which means that it's less of, I would think that sort of connection type thing is more the difference between a catchable pass and an on target pass. It's like knowing the little nuances of what, that player's speed or what he's likely to do in a certain situation. But yeah, and it's interesting that both Waddle and Smith are part of these offenses that have basically these like 2 primary pass catchers. And these are just the 2 who have gotten more accurate passes.
Hopkins being in there is interesting.
Yeah, you think so?
He's only been back for a couple weeks.
Yeah, that's true. I had a minimum of, I think, 30 targets or so to qualify here. But yeah, Kyler, say what you will about him sort of in general and that sort of thing, but like he typically is a pretty accurate thrower. The thing that I found interesting about Hopkins actually is in terms of the metric catchable percentage, like DeAndre Hopkins is exactly the player that like increases the range of what is catchable.
Yep.
Right. We saw that catch for him, was that last week? So there is a little bit of control, I guess, that a player like him has over his circumstances.
Yeah, I would be interested to see what the next highest Cardinal is.
And especially with the collection of players on that team, like AJ Green, I suppose, is in that Hopkins kind of mold, but is at a very different point in his career. And then the other guys in that offense are more of the speed type guys. And so, yeah, in terms of that, I don't think, it's interesting that Hopkins is up here to your point about not being available for a big chunk of the season, but it's not like he's new to the offense. So, all right. So going on to the next one, we'll talk about quarterbacks who have had their receivers drop a lot of passes. So this is sort of the inverse of the previous one of now we're talking about receivers who are letting quarterbacks down or helping them out. So in terms of players who have been unlucky, Panthers quarterbacks, both Baker Mayfield and PJ Walker are in the top 10 of drop rate on catchable passes, which is not great. And then an interesting combo here, we can sort of border into lucky and unlucky. In terms of unlucky players, Carson Wentz did have 10% of his catchable targets dropped. And Taylor Heinicke, on the other hand, has had 3% of his catchable targets dropped. And those guys are on the opposite ends of the leaderboard, or so to speak here. So this could be an example of, if you chose to take it as, players having issues with their quarterbacks, this would be kind of an interesting way to sabotage your quarterback, but I would not speculate on that.
Speculation's fun. Speculate right now.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is a good example in the way that some of the other stuff that we've been talking about isn't the case. Like these are really like the same. It's the same receivers, although you could argue, with some of the injuries that they've had in the receiving group, I guess there's probably a different distribution of pass catchers that Wentz was throwing to what Heineke's been throwing to. But it is kind of interesting to have like the same players in the same scheme with a difference like that. And it's also, it's worth acknowledging that this is 10% versus 3%. Like it's not a humongous difference, but drop passes really in the same kind of way to the third and fourth down stuff. Like a dropped pass is the difference between, 10, 15 yards and losing a down. So it's a pretty big, it's sort of the equivalent of like a sack in the opposite direction, right?
That's an interesting way of framing that.
I'll admit that I thought about it for about a quarter of a second, so it might not be the most legitimate analogy.
No, I was being serious. That wasn't sarcastic.
I know, but it's very possible that it's absolute nothing. All right. So next, I guess we can talk about, in terms of teammate effects, you can also have, your offensive line picking you up or bringing you down. Bryce, what do you got?
So we'll take a quick look at running backs who have had particularly good or particularly bad offensive lines. The running backs who have been let down, there are two notable ones. The first is Ramondre Stevenson, who Bill Belichick has been effusive in his praise of recently. He's 10th in points earned per play. I'm using a minimum of 100 carries, and he has the second highest hit at line percentage at nearly 50% of his carries, which is a lot. And building off of that, not surprisingly, the Pats' offensive line ranks 31st in run blocking total points per play. So he has been shouldering the load in more ways than one in New England this season. And then the other guy is Tyler Algier, who ranks 6th in points earned per play. And the Falcons' offensive line is leading the league by a considerable margin in blown blocks on rushing plays with 59. And the next highest team is like high 40s.
Oh, wow. That's a big, I guess they run a lot, right? So that's
right.
A little bit.
But I think the second, I don't have it up in front of me right now, but I think the second team was the Niners.
Oh, that is
also run quite a bit.
Yeah.
But we would also expect, to an extent, teams that run quite a bit to have more blown blocks just by virtue of the volume, but it's still a lot.
Yeah, and this is not the Niners and the Falcons, like the Niners being up there is almost more notable than the Falcons, just because of what we think of those teams. But yeah, the offensive line, I going back to the Patriots thing, getting hit at the line 48% of the time that's tough. And I suppose, if we're using points earned as the outcome measure, like that takes into account, if a guy breaks a bunch of tackles, he's getting credit for that. So part of the Algier and Stevenson, ranking as high as they do is that their offensive lines have been not as good.
Somebody's got to get credit.
Yeah, then that's what we're capturing here. I was also looking at those leaderboards this morning, and if we're looking at, so that's the bad end of the spectrum. The good end of the spectrum is, a shocking revelation that the Eagles and Ravens offensive lines have been good at run blocking. So they're both at the top of the run blocking total points leaderboards. Both teams are in the top 5 in yards before contact per attempt. So, the Miles Sanderses of the world, it would be great if J.K. Dobbins could be healthy to see what he could do in that offense. And I just saw a mock draft on The Athletic that suggested that the Eagles would use their late first round pick to take a running back. And I'm thinking you probably don't need to take a first round running back if you have the kinds of personnel and scheme that they've shown to have. All right, let's move from being, fortune or misfortune when it comes to your teammates to fortune or misfortune when it comes to your opponents. So you, in a different way, you could argue that your teammates are consistent over time and that you have some effect on the way that your teammates perform. Some of these stats will be kind of similar to the stuff that we've already talked about, but this will be related to being lucky or unlucky when it comes to how your opponents have performed. So we can start with sort of dropped passes in multiple ways. So the first would be quarterbacks who might throw interceptable passes that are either dropped or actually intercepted. So as an example, Matt Ryan has thrown 9 interceptable passes and none of them have been dropped. And that's, well, unfortunate. And on the lucky side of things, well, this is a different answer, I suppose. PJ Walker threw 4 dropped interceptions in a little over 100 attempts, which is just like your interception rate would be crazy high if he had all of those legitimately intercepted. So he was a little bit lucky in those 100 attempts as it was. And then the more interesting one, as far as I'm concerned, is Tom Brady only has 2 picks, and that can be, called out as a reflection of his performance this season. But he has thrown 12 interceptable passes, and only 2 of them have been intercepted. So a lot of dropped interceptions for him. And this is sort of an example of why, like, using touchdown to interception ratio is not necessarily a great way of evaluating a quarterback, because those numbers are a very small slice of a quarterback's performance in the year.
You know what's really lucky about the Brady thing is all the Surface tablets that have not been broken.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe, I don't know, Brady might be a process guy. He might throw a tablet if he has a dropped interception. But yeah, you're right. We've saved a lot of tech by not having all of those intercepted.
He's got a game with the Saints coming up, so this might not last long.
Well, you can't undo the 10 that have already been dropped. But yeah, and again, giving ourselves a pat on the back. Like, in the total points system, we count dropped interceptions as though they are interceptions. And I suppose could argue for kind of acknowledging that some, all passes have some probability of being dropped. But the idea is, if it's in your hands, we assume you're catching it, and we're going to give you credit or debit as though you delivered the ball to the place where a person probably should have caught it. So Brady, from a total points perspective, is getting dinged pretty heavily for all of those dropped interceptions. Speaking of drops, we can talk about, if you were on defense, if your opponents drop a lot of passes or few passes, that's also a thing that theoretically is lucky or unlucky for you. So teams that have been unlucky in this regard, who have had their opponents catch a pretty high percentage of their passes, the Bears, the Chargers, and the Chiefs all have around a 3% drop rate for their opponents' receivers. And on the luck side of things, the Commanders, Steelers, and Bengals all have had their opponents drop closer to 9 or 10%. So the Steelers being lucky is sort of reflected in some of the stuff we were looking at earlier in terms of the Pythagorean wins and war-related metrics. And the Bears and Chargers, to some extent, have shown up in a few of these lists. The Chiefs being unlucky is also kind of interesting, just because they're having a pretty good season right now.
No harm, no foul.
Yeah, for them, it's fine. And you could argue, like, for the Steelers being lucky, like, they probably weren't in a position to be competing heavily anyway. So if they're like, if it's I suppose you could argue that if you wanted them to be bad, speaking of which, James, did you want the Steelers to be bad this year, or did you want them to be good?
I wanted them to be bad so we can take a quarterback next year. But
okay, so you're not a pick
too early.
Not a Pickett guy.
He's growing on me a little bit. It seems like he's got some of the intangible stuff that might be able to take them forward, but we'll see how his development comes. His arm looks pretty not strong, to say the least. So we'll see if he can be more than a system quarterback, but I don't know. I have my doubts. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, because I was just going to say, like, if you don't want your team to be lucky in this respect, if you want your team to not win games, it's rather unfortunate to have to fall on the lucky side of this ledger.
Pickett is just such a weird player, because he was, I know I've beat this drum a couple times, but he was hailed as this pro-ready guy, and he was a 4-year starter and took a victory lap at Pitt, and he just had the one good year, and he was supposed to have all these intangibles, and he's looked rough.
Yeah, the performance has been choppy at best. I was going to say overall on the Steelers' performance, the goal is to always get to 500 or better. So watch the next 5-6 weeks here of our charge to 500.
Yeah, we don't. Our numbers here suggest that they are fortunate to get where they are. So could be not happening.
Good.
Good. Exactly. All right. So another thing that is sort of example of your opponents performing well or poorly would be special teams performance. You know, getting a lot of, especially as a fan, it can be kind of rough to watch your opponents nail really long field goals. So Bryce, which teams have been lucky or unlucky in that respect?
The Saints have been really unlucky. So their opponents on 45 plus yard field goals are making them at a rate of 87%, which is about 15 percentage points above the league average. And they've also made 13 of them. And so that's more than one a game on average. It's 3 higher than the next highest team. And it's already the second highest number since 2016. We have 6 weeks left in the season.
Wow.
So they have been particularly unfortunate. I probably should have followed this up and actually looked at the field goals that were made on a case-by-case basis to see the leverage of the situations they were made in. But at face value, that's pretty brutal.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing that's worth noting for the Saints is like how many of those games have been at home. So it's like you expect your opponents and you to make more kicks when you're at home in that kind of spot.
Yeah, that was my first thought, but just looking at the lists from seasons past, it was kind of a mix of some dome teams and outdoor stadiums. So that definitely has an effect, but I think that it was still a lot.
Yeah, to be already the second most in the last several seasons, and we have a bunch of weeks left. Like that's a lot of long kicks.
They've been playing in that stadium.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then the Cowboys are the next highest at 10, and that's another indoor stadium, which is worth mentioning.
Yeah, but you hope. I guess this comes up a lot more in baseball with like how stadiums get constructed and both teams have to play in it, but the stadium context can swing against you sometimes, which is unfortunate when you're having taxpayers pay as much as they are for these stadiums. But anyway, all right. So the last one we have here is, I guess you could argue this could have come in the first category, but this is teams who have faced particularly good or bad schedules, but I'm looking at it through the lens of the quality of the quarterback. So we have at SIS our world's number one quarterback ranking based on, at least conceptually, based on a Bill James statistic that was created initially for starting pitchers and then also for batters to sort of like track a multi-year quality measure for, in this case, quarterbacks. And so we can look week by week and see how good were the quarterbacks that you were facing each week. And this is also kind of interesting, as we'll see. So for example, the team that has been the unluckiest in terms of having an average opponent's quarterback ranking of 17th among the 100 or so quarterbacks that are in the NFL right now is the Bills. And so they've faced, in sort of like descending order of ranking, Mahomes, Stafford, Rodgers, Cousins, Tua, Tannehill, Lamar, etc. And it's worth noting that like at the time, Stafford and Rodgers were a more formidable matchup than we know them to be now. And so admittedly not Stafford with whatever's going on with the Rams in general and also injury, and then Rodgers, we've sort of seen what's happened with him, especially with Adams out of the fold. But this is what's kind of interesting here is that, so the Bills had those quarterbacks at the top. If you look at the opposite end of the spectrum, the team that has been the luckiest in terms of having the worst quarterbacks that they're facing, the best quarterback that the Bengals have faced in terms of ranking has been Tua, followed by Tannehill. And so, and they also faced Lamar. And so those three guys who are at the top of the Bengals list are like 4th through 6th on the list of quarterbacks the Bills have faced. And the Bengals have also faced, Trubisky and Joe Flacco and PJ Walker and Kenny Pickett and Andy Dalton and Baker Mayfield and even Cooper Rush. So that list of quarterbacks, the average rank is 44th. So they're averaging playing backups, you could argue, which is kind of interesting, especially for a team that is, has looked pretty good, even with Jamar Chase being out of the lineup the last few weeks. And it looked like they're going to make a run, but also they've been pretty lucky to have the kind of quarterback matchups that they've had.
I want to go back to the Bills for a second. You noted that Stafford and Rodgers are not playing up to their usual standards this year for different respective reasons. But the Bills have also played Tua and Jacoby Brissett, who prior coming into this year were not very well thought of. And Tua more so than Brissett, but both have been having really good years. So that kind of offsets it a little bit, I think.
Yeah, and as would be the case, this is a multi-year ranking, so it doesn't move. It doesn't move super quickly in terms of adjusting to how a player has performed. But Tua, for example, playing him in the beginning of the season would mean something different in terms of your, what we expect from the quality of the player than what we expect from him now. So yeah, that's definitely a part of it, and also a part of it, the Bills have, a lot of your NFL schedule is predetermined, but also your performance in the previous season informs your opponents the next season. So the Bills theoretically had a tougher schedule going in. The Bengals would theoretically, they don't have a quote first place schedule, but it is a team that went to the Super Bowl. So to get lucky in terms of your opponents in that respect. And you can see some of the quarterbacks I was mentioning, it's a lot of backups or a lot of players on teams who already had unsettled quarterback situations. So that's pretty interesting. I will note also, if you go to sort of the next group there, teams that have been the luckiest in terms of facing the worst quarterbacks, the next three teams are Vikings, Eagles, Giants. So it is, and those are the teams that when we looked at the performance above your Pythagorean record and whatever, these are the teams that are having really good seasons by record. And part of it is the Eagles have the best record in the league. And so they're always going to be outperforming basically every metric like this. But the Vikings and Giants showing up there it's another reflection of they're not necessarily that good. They're getting put in pretty fortunate situations.
Yeah, and a note on the Giants too. Their schedule coming up is definitely a lot more difficult, with two coming up against the Eagles, two against the Commanders, having to go to Minnesota. And taking a look at their schedule, it looks like the only other game that they might be favored in the rest of the year is a home game against the Colts in Week 17. So can certainly see this regression coming pretty quickly.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, the Commanders, I think we're also towards the bottom here. So a lot of it is the NFC East quarterbacks, especially if you played Hurts earlier in the season when he, again, rolling window, he's higher now than he was at the beginning of the year. The quality of the quarterbacks there, not so great. And yeah, if you run into even the difference, Cooper Rush appears on the bad quarterback list. If you face the Cowboys with Dak versus the Cowboys with Rush, yeah, they won some games with Rush, but you typically want to face the backup quarterback. So if you run into teams at the right time, that can work out for you. I will also note that on the, behind the Bills on the unlucky side, we see once again, actually we see the Steelers again, but it's in the opposite direction, right? So the Steelers have faced a pretty good slate of quarterbacks. Same with the Lions, the Chiefs, and the Dolphins. So just, these are just examples of the kinds of things that impact the way that a team or a player's season ends up that are often hidden and you might attribute to some kind of skill thing, but there are a lot of other factors that contribute. All right. For Bryce Rossler, James Weaver, and the MIA Matt Manocherian, and our producer Justin Stein, thanks for listening to the Off the Charts podcast.